Welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Author Series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. Our theme for 2021 is Taking Care. We're celebrating different ways we can take care of ourselves and take care of others this year. You can check out our upcoming schedule at wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. Feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function. Books are available through our bookstore Ampersand Books. I'll put the link in the chat. We're so excited to have Brenda Peynado with us this evening. First, we'll hear her read, then she'll be in conversation with Angelique Stevens. Angelique is a writer and professor of English and philosophy at Monroe Community College. Brenda Peynado is a Dominican American writer of fiction, nonfiction, and screenplays. Her stories have won an O. Henry Award, a Pushcart Prize, and the Chicago Tribune's Nelson Algren Literary Award, a selection for the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, and the Best Small Fictions, among other awards. Her fiction appears in the Georgia Review, the Southern Review, the Kenyon Review, and more than 40 other journals. She teaches in the MFA program at the University of Central Florida. The Rock Eaters is her debut collection. Threaded with magic, transcending time and place, her stories explore what it means to cross borders and break down walls, personally and politically. The writer Jeff VanderMeer has called it a stunning debut collection comprised of provocative stories that are oddly healing and horizon expanding, an exciting new voice. Brenda, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to share these stories with you all.
Thank you.
So I will start off by reading, I'm going to read the title story, The Rock Eaters. And it's all of the stories in the collection are usually have some kind of magic, some kind of science fictional conceit. So this story does a great job of introducing readers to what the collection does. We were the first generation to leave our island country. We were the ones who developed a distinct float to our walk on the day we came of age. Soon enough, we were hovering inches above the ground, then somersaulting with the clouds, finally discovering we could fly as far as we'd ever wanted. And so we left. Decades later, we brought our children back to see our home country. That year, we all decided we were ready to return. We jackknifed through clouds and dodged large birds. We held our children tightly. They had not yet learned to fly. Behind us trailed roped together lines of suitcases packed with gifts from abroad. We wondered who would remember us. Our parents, those who were still alive, came out to greet us, hands on their brows like visors. Some were expecting us. Others were surprised, terrified at the spectacle of millions of their prodigals blotting the sky with our billowing skirts, our shirts starched for the arrival. We touched down on our parents' driveways, skidding to rough landings at their feet, denting cars, squashing flowers, rattling windows. Our old friends and siblings, the ones we'd left behind, kept their doors locked. They peered through window blinds at the flattened flower beds, the suitcases that had burst and strewn packages all over the yards and streets. Our youngest children squealing now that they'd been released, the peace we'd broken by returning. They didn't trust us, not after our betrayal decades ago. The whiff of money we'd earned or lost in other countries like a suspect stench. Our parents hugged their grandchildren and brought them inside to houses with no electricity, candles wavering like we were in a seance. More brownouts, they told us. We remember, we said, recoiling at how little the place fit us anymore. Those first nights we slept in our old beds, our feet hanging over the edges, the noises of the city and the country crowing and honking us awake, music from radios and guitars, celebrations we'd not been invited to. We dragged our children along to knock on the doors of old friends and siblings. the ones who'd never developed the ability to fly. They eventually, reluctantly, opened their doors. At first, we sat stiffly on couches and inquired after their health and others we once knew. Then we got them to laugh with us about the time we pulled the nun skirts or put gum in the kink of a rival's hair, when we caught baby chicks in the village and raised them, or cracked open almonds on the malecon. Then their children came out shyly out of their rooms and took ours by the hand. We smiled when we saw them climbing trees together in the patios, their children showing ours how to eat cajuelito solemán and aceloras from the branch. We introduced our children to everyone we used to know, at colmados by the side of the road, at the baseball fields, at country clubs we had to beg to be let back into. We showed our children the flamboyant trees in the parks, blooms of coral red spilling in the dirt. We showed them the granite striated through the rock faces of mountains, the glimmering pebbles under waterfalls, the red dust that stained the seats of their best clothes. We walked past the stray dogs that growled and whined. The most ancient among them remembered us, wagging their tails when they saw us and running to sniff our offspring. We dunked our children into the rivers we'd once swum. We dug through the banks for the arrowheads that belonged to the Taínos, who'd been erased after the Spanish came, their remnants lost in the mud. Lost, our children whispered in awe and fear, turning the black, glinting points in their palms, testing the hardness of flint between their teeth. Back in our foreign homes, we'd never talked to them of history. We remembered we'd been happy. We love this land, we said. We forget why we ever left. Then the first child came of age. We weren't expecting it. She seemed so young, skinny, her curly hair still in little girl's braids. Nevertheless, we saw the evidence, underwear buried in the trash, the unmistakable spots of blood. We saw her heels rise up, saw her walking on her toes like a careful ballerina. That was how it had started for us. We would soon no longer have to carry her and others strapped to our back as we flew. We were excited for her and sad. We threw the first girl a party, everyone invited, but we didn't advertise why, hoping not to embarrass her or alienate our flightless old friends who'd been so welcoming by rubbing her flight in their faces. The party brought us all together, all those children speaking the languages of the countries we'd adopted, the local children finding ours exotic and precious. They all screeched as they cannonballed into the pool. The first girl raised her arms at the top of the diving board. We held our breath. She flipped off the board, spun like a starfish. She brought herself to an unnatural stop in the air, just before hitting the skin of the pool. Then she let herself slip under without a splash. Bravo, we cheered. We let the grandparents cut the cake. Their teeth glinted, their arms arced possessively around our children, showing them off to the parents of those who'd stayed. The grandparents wore the fancy foreign clothes we'd brought them, clothes we couldn't really afford and had put on credit cards or bought with pawn jewelry. But we had to show them we'd been right all this time to have flown away. After so many years of loneliness and the futures we'd broken by disappearing from them, how proud they were that everyone had returned. But how long could we stay? We made no promises. We searched for the first girl to give her a slice of cake, but when we saw her, it was clear she did not want to be found. She was behind the bathroom sheds, floating in a squat near the dirt. We hid in the branches of the flamboyants. We watched her gather fistfuls of red rocks from the dirt and place them on her tongue, sucking before she swallowed. This was nothing we'd ever done when we turned. After we let ourselves drift back to the party, we didn't speak of it. We thought perhaps it was the iron she needed, having lost her first blood. A few days later, another girl came of age, floating down her apartment stairs soundlessly. Her grandmother startled and dropped the pot of sancocho she was carrying. That night, the first girl and the second girl huddled together in the back of a colmado, the first girl showing the second how far up she could float, about the height of a counter. She spun gymnastics in the air. The second girl strained and bit her lip and rose half a foot. The boys, who would turn soon too, surrounded them like a pack. They played jacks on the floor underneath the girls, but it was hard for the girls to play. If they didn't concentrate, they drifted up too high to reach the jacks. Eventually, the girls gave up, and the man who owned the colmado slid them both beers in plastic cups. They floated on their backs, hair hanging from the backs of their heads. The boys paced around them like magicians about to cut their lovely assistants in half. When we put the younger children to bed that night, they would not be soothed with flying tricks or bedtime stories. When we told them their favorites, the ones about the children who flew off from home, never to return again, when we read them Peter Pan, when we told them about arriving in strange lands, they said they were afraid. Will that happen to us? They asked. We don't ever want to leave, they said. We underestimated the ways we were the same as our children, the drive to want what you didn't have. For us, it had been the blinding sky, distance, the promise of the unknown, forgetting our old lives, which seemed puny the further we flew from them. For our children, it was the red ground, the summer sun, a feeling of belonging, a history that trailed back generations. A few of the boys changed, sleepily stumbling out the door in the morning to converge in hovering packs by the rivers, parks, and alleyways. At first, they didn't even notice how their heels weren't striking when they ran out the front door. The ones who hadn't yet turned started compulsively checking the space under their feet for the slightest cushion of air. More of the children turned. They came home later and later every night. When sneaking back into the house, they had no need for tiptoeing. We turned on the lights. We asked them where they'd been. They smelled of beer and iron. They shrugged and said flippantly, with our cousins. As they floated up the stairs, we saw burns from twisted rope on their ankles, beneath the hems of their jeans. We spied on them from parked cars. Our old friends had to drive us because the back alleyways and streams had changed courses since we moved away. We saw the local children, the sons and daughters of the people we'd left behind, hold out ropes made from palm leaves and point to the ground. The locals tied the ropes around our children's ankles, tied them to their own flightless ones. It's fine, our old friend said. They're just playing. Our siblings reminded us of our own coming of age, ropes tethered around our ankles in case we couldn't return, experimenting with how far up we could go while they watched from the ground. Our old friends dropped us back home, slamming car doors firmly behind us. Were they jealous? Did they want us gone? Were they hoping we would take them with us? Already we could feel the itch in the arches of our feet that propelled us to fly over borders. We were relieved we would be leaving soon. We didn't notice them at first, tied over the rope burns, thin snippets of string, anklets threaded with pebbles. They reminded us of bell collars worn by errant cats. When we asked the children about it, they stayed silent. Among the parents, we called them friendship anklets to hide our uneasiness. Then the fad spread among those who hadn't even turned. From the balconies and the patios where we drank coconut water and chinola juice with rum, we could hear their laughter as they wove their anklets. They spent the rest of their time playing tag in the canopies of the trees, leaping over roofs, splashing under waterfalls, and lounging with the stray dogs who put their heads in the children's laps and growled at us if we got too close. We felt guilty that we would have to drag them back with us when we left, guilty for soon separating them from their new friends. But when they brought us puppies, they'd watched a stray dog birth, still dripping with placenta, asking us if they could keep one. We told them no. Everything belongs in its place, we said. We reminded them of the pets back in our other homes, the school friends, the painted bedrooms, all waiting for us to return. When we suggested how proud we would be when they flew home without our help, they froze and sank a little in their airspace. They asked the grandparents to tell them stories of how we used to be when we were young. They couldn't believe that those versions of us had turned into our older selves. They hated us, we knew. It was inevitable, a phase. The second girl who turned was always pushing herself to new heights, trying to outshine the first girl who had a head start. One day, the children came running to get us. She's gone, they yelled. She flew up in a race to touch a cloud. She won, but she couldn't stop. She kept going higher, shrinking in their sight. None of the children were able to go after her. We sprung up from the ground, leapt off the balconies, searched for her in the atmosphere. Our old friends covered the ground in case she'd fallen. After days of searching, we still couldn't find her. Her parents kept looking. The rest of us thought, maybe if we just waited, she'd find her way back. The younger children had nightmares. When they played catch and balls sailed over their heads, they never jumped for fear they'd leave the ground. They held hands and dug their fingers into the stray dog's fur. What are you doing? We asked. We don't want to fly, they said. We want to stay. The rocks tied around their ankles got heavier. The children no longer hovered. They were weighted down with the red stones of the mountains. The stones dragged on the floor and clattered as they walked. Even much younger children tied stones to their legs. A toddler tripped over hers and gashed her head. This was going too far, we agreed, and we cut them all off. That would end the matter, we thought. The summer was nearly over. We watched the ones who'd already turned sink lower and lower, even without ropes binding them. We conferred among ourselves. It's the locals, we thought. All those children of our former friends, bringing them down, showing them how to stay rooted, doing terrible things in the dark. Look at how crime has tripled since we left, how the buildings crumble and rust, how horrible their clothes are. Who knows how this country has changed for the worse, we said. So we forbade them from seeing other children, the flightless children. Still, our children wouldn't fly. We couldn't explain it. We tried throwing them up into the air to give them a head start, but they came down hard. One girl broke her leg. Only then did we think it was cruel to keep lifting them up and dropping them, like mother birds pushing chicks from the nest. We noticed no more children turned. Perhaps no more were ready. Many of them were coming down with stomach aches, clutching their bellies, which we blamed on the awful sanitation of our old country. When the grandparents offered us ice with our water, we curled our noses in disgust. On the hottest day of the year, we discovered the very first girl who had turned, crouched behind the concrete outhouse of the pool again, dripping wet in her bathing suit, selecting rocks from the path that marked the edge of the civilized grass from the wild selva where rivers coursed through the mountains. She was eating them again. The confidence with which she selected them implied she'd done this often. She swallowed 20 of them while we watched, and then got up from her crouch. She hopped on one foot, landed awkwardly, heavily. Satisfied, she rejoined the others. Our hearts sank at her failure. Before, she'd flown as gracefully as a swan. One by one, when they thought no one was looking, the children slipped behind the country club, into the woods of the farms, behind the fences, between the concrete hurricane-proof houses and wooden shacks where their grandparents still lived, and ate bellyfuls of rocks. Our children even offered stones to the hungry dogs, held pebbles out for the toucans and the parrots. They were generous with their weight. The youngest, the ñoños who still listened to us, these we lifted, surprised and groaning with their new weight, and cradled them in our laps. Still sleepy with milk, they confessed that they were still afraid, that they never wanted to leave, that they loved everything about our old country. They wanted the ground more than they wanted to fly. What was so great about flying, they asked. We shook the older children. They were responsible for all of this. We yanked them by their braids, dragged them by their collars, threatened them with belts or wooden spoons or chancletas like our parents had done, while our parents looked on. They're too old for that, the grandparents said. It never worked with you, they said. We yelled at them to stay out of it. Our children wouldn't break. They informed us they were staying here, holding in yelps of pain, whether we liked it or not. They would run away from us if they had to. They said that they ate rocks because if they did not, their bellies burned for them. We knew it was time to go. It had been dangerous bringing our children back here, letting them fall in love with the history and with the people they could have been. We remembered all the things we'd hated about our old country, but we'd forgotten our own rebelliousness. We packed our suitcases, dressed our younger children warmly for the flight, said goodbye to our parents who tried to cling to us as we rose into the air. Husbands and wives held hands in a circle around their struggling children, threading arms to lock in their incredible burdens. The children, with their bellies full of rocks, weighing them down immensely. Everyone groaned while the children kicked and screamed and bit and sobbed. Boys and girls fighting us and pushing at our arms. The sky was like a battle between angels. We jettisoned the smallest bags, the blankets for the cool air, the fruits for the journey. It all landed roughly in the red dirt. Our old friends watched the great struggle between us and our shameful kids, extending their hands to grab the items dropping to the ground. Then we cut loose the big luggage, the clothes we bought to impress everybody, all our precious things. But our children, we had to keep our children. The oldest kids, the strongest kids, the ones with the biggest bellies full of the most rocks, they flew loose from our grasp. We tried to chase them mid-flight, but they were stronger than us. We would lose the younger children too if we kept after them. Some of them fell to their grandparents on the ground, where their hair was tucked back from their faces, their chins cupped, giant plates of food set out in front of them. Others, unmoored, had not eaten enough rocks, had a capacity for flight that overcame stone and flint and dirt. But they were young and did not have the skill we did to fly exactly where we wanted. We'd had decades to practice. We tried to catch them, but they kicked us away. They clumped in groups and fought us off. The last time we saw them, they were thousands of feet above the ground, grasping clumsily for each other, fingers stretching in terror through the thinnest of atmospheres. The smallest ones, our babies, and the ones who didn't struggle, these we were able to save. We returned to our houses, our apartments, our ranches, the suburbs, the cities, the farmland. We returned to the lives we felt understood us. But the taste for rocks never left their mouths. Some of them we starved, forbidding them stones. They learned to fly, but they drifted, never quite in the direction we wanted, trajectories loose and winding. Some of them fasted by choice, growing into bags of bones before our eyes. Lighter than ever, they floated away, sometimes in the middle of the night through open windows. We knew now, from our own parents' struggles, there was no bringing them back. The ones we were left with, their bellies full of rocks, they hovered a few inches above the ground, but no further, never able to sink completely. They stayed in the homes of our new countries, always wanting to get back to that place where we all dreamed we were happy, but never able to return. These were the ones we could still embrace, our rock eaters, grit in their mouths, hearts too heavy, feet too light. Thank you.
Wow. Whew, there's so much there. I can't even. I'm glad you read that one, this title piece to your book. There's so much in this piece, in all of your stories. There's loss, the coming of age, immigration. In that line, we underestimated the ways we were the same as our children. It's so beautiful. It feels like everything. But those rocks, I'm just wondering about your process, one, in writing this piece, and those rocks. I mean, reading it, I'm wanting to understand what these rocks stand for, and there's so much there. There's this idea of, the terra firma, the country, this identity that is so embedded in place, and the way that identity changes between the parents moving, flying off into the new space, and the children's identity changing as they come to the new place. and the rocks, they represent so much. So if you could just maybe talk about how you filled this piece out, how how you built those rocks, and then again, it becomes the title of the book.
Yeah, thanks, Angelique. I lived for a year in the Dominican Republic while I was researching this novel. And in my childhood, I had often gone back. I spent sort of school years in the States and then summers in the Dominican Republic with my family. And that year, I think I was maybe 28, 27. That year I was expecting a homecoming. I remember when I was little always saying, I wish that I had grown up in the Dominican Republic, which my parents always found flabbergasting because they were like, we came to this country to sort of give you a different life. And they didn't have a terrible life in the Dominican Republic, but they were really astounded as to why I would say that. And so that year that I lived in the Dominican Republic, I used to walk my dog at this park that was rock-scaped. And I knew I wanted to write a story about these kids and these rocks. And I may have seen one of the kids stick a rock in their mouth, the way that kids do, just stick everything in their mouths. And I kept trying to write a story about these kids and the idea of like growing up and transformation. And I thought the story was about those kids, those Dominican kids who'd lived there their whole lives. And like came after my dog, chasing me to try to play with him. And it wouldn't work. And it wasn't until I realized that I wasn't writing a story about those kids. I was writing a story about myself at that time, that suddenly it was more than just children transforming. It was about kind of everything that I felt that year that I went back, where I was expecting a homecoming with my cousins. And in a lot of ways, I realized that, I couldn't pretend that I was from a place that I did not grow up. And so the homecoming that I was expecting didn't happen. And just my complicated feelings about all of that and sort of coming to terms with being American. And then the rock eating that I had witnessed that kid do suddenly was me. And I was able to, after I thought of this idea of this kid eating a rock as me somehow, then from there, I was like, well, what's the opposite and where's the conflict? And then that's where the flying came from. And then the story just sort of took off. Pun intended.
It's so, there's so much pain in there, but there's also just so much beauty. And you think about that idea of the parents taking, wanting a different life and not understanding these children. But so much of it is very similar to the stories that we all sort of have as we're emerging into adulthood, wanting whatever it is, something different, the parents wanting to go to a new place and the kids wanting to come back to the beginning. But I really do love this idea of identity and how deeply tied it is to this sort of terra firma, the land, and maybe not even be able to fully reach that sort of identity. And in some ways, only doing that by eating the rocks. That's just so powerful to me.
Yeah, it's so interesting how we can, there's like these myths that our parents tell us that as writers, we're often latched onto these sort of like the myths that came before. As a child of diaspora, there's this weird rootlessness in that, because they're stories of people we've never met, places we've never been. Whereas, if you've stayed in the same town your whole life, or at least the same state, you have sort of an idea of continuity. And it's always amazing to me, people who've had that continuity, how they reimagine their myths instead of the diasporic sort of myth experience.
Yeah, I love that, reimagining your myth. I think about that sort of duality that that one experiences when they're not from the place that they're living, and it's always, you can see it in that hyphen, right? African American and Native American, those sorts of things. So You do this, you do a beautiful job of blending the reality of life and the magical parts. In Thoughts and Prayers, you, in the opening story in your book, you have this reality of immigrant life, of inequities, and then the school shootings. But then there's these angels on the rooftops, and each family sort of pays homage to them every morning. Despite their magical nature, these angels feel so real. They feel like that is exactly what we do. You know, we sort of pay homage to this being, this thing that we don't understand every day, that sits up on high. Can you just maybe explain how that works for you, the blending of the real parts and the magical parts?
Yeah, I think it works differently in every story when I think about it. Sometimes it's the magic that I'm most interested in, and the magic is sort of representative of the very thing that I'm trying to get at. So I'm able to sort of make the plot and the external the same as the internal thing that the character is going through. But sometimes it's details that make even the real thing that I'm trying to get at just seem that much more surreal. So I think of a story like The Rock Eaters and the Stones of Sorrow Lake. In that case, both the Sorrow Stones and then the stones that the kids are eating, they're both very much the thing that I would like to talk about. And then there are stories like I would say Thoughts and Prayers, where the angels, yes, are part of it. But what I wanted to think about was the ways that we think about violence and protection, and the ways that protection itself can cause harm. And the angels were merely yet another manifestation of the ways we think we're protecting by, sending out these often feels like useless thoughts and prayers.
Yeah.
And then the way that the mother of the main character was like, I'm going to protect you. And it is precisely that need to protect our own, to protect our family at the expense of others, or to protect ourselves at the expense of others, that sometimes it comes out of love, and yet it feels useless, and in some cases tragically harmful. So in that case, the birds were a great way of making that feeling of love feel just as bizarro as any of the other conceits in the story, as a way of sort of short-circuiting maybe our feelings about whatever it is that the story is talking about.
Yeah, that those angels, they reminded me of the angel in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. And there's this line in that short story that's always stuck with me. That the majority of the people in that story, they understood the angel's passivity was not that of a hero taking ease, but that of a cataclysm in repose. And I feel like there's so much of that sort of ease and repose and cataclysm in your work happening, just sort of buzzing under the surface all the time. And I find that beautiful. Could you maybe talk about those sort of two opposing forces, the beauty and the horror, how they play out in your stories? And then there's a question from Allison. Hi, Allison, that I want to ask afterwards.
Yeah, I love that way of thinking about it, cataclysm and repose. I think both things are so present in our world, is beauty and horror, sorrow and love at the same time. And a lot of times they're born from each other. And that is, to me, a big obsession of me as a writer, is just, I don't think there are villains in my stories, but there are people who, out of being human, and not just being flawed human, but out of the very needs of love and desire and a desperation to connect, that out of those things, such sorrow can come from such love and such desperation. And so those things always seem to me to be balanced in the world with, you know, the beauty that we have, that we hunger for, and then the sorrow and the horror that comes from trying to reach it, from trying to get more, and from who has that beauty at the expense of whose terror and whose horror, and that balance of power and accumulation. And it's one of the things that I think is so striking about the world and creates such juxtaposition when we're able to look at these things side by side. And I think it's one of the reasons why I'm always drawn to magical realism, as that the magic alongside the realism, but sometimes it's the realism that seems the more horrifying, and the magic that seems the most real. And I'm definitely influenced by Marquez in those ways, and the Latino boom of magical realists, and the way that they had colonialism as such a horrifying, terrifying force of magic and wondrousness. And the ways that they were able to respond to that with sort of awe and wonder, but also at the same time, like, yes, this is just the magic that happens every day, and sort of move on from there.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I always tell my students that there are no angels and devils. Life is so much more complicated, you know, all of those, the gray space in between. I want to ask a question from Allison Myers. Brenda, what does flying represent for you? In dreams, it can alternately be both an expression of power, powerlessness, or anxiety, and probably much more. Who of the magic realists inspire you, or do they? And you sort of answered that question.
Yeah, I love the magical realists of the Latino boom. So when I was young, I read Isabel Allende and Marquez. And when I was older, I started reading Juan Rulfo. Is got this really bizarre Pedro Paramo of a ghost town, and a man that sort of becomes eaten, is how I would say, by this ghost town, becoming a ghost himself, and then Cesar Aria's ghosts. And I just love the way that horror is so beautiful in those contexts, much the way that you were talking about, Angelique, where those are both very intertwined. I think it all comes down to the word awe, and how awe has within it both wonder and also terror, sort of being blind struck by something so beautiful that it's also terrifying. And so I love the way that their stories feel like myth. They feel like stories that have been passed down and fine-tuned and sort of made into the pressure of a diamond. Whereas a lot of, I think as a writer, I hate scene, and scene feels to me so undigested, which some writers are really going for, but I really like the digestion of the ways that myth feels. So in that way, I'm really influenced by them. But then what does flying represent to me? I will say I often have dreams of flying, but they're terrifying because at any moment I can drop. And the way that I fly in my dreams, I spent a lot of time in pools growing up, and there's a story in The Rock Eaters that sort of reflects that. There's a group of children who's plagued by drownings and pools. And so for me, flying in my dreams was always, I had to hold my breath to sort of stay buoyant. And it was something that was razor thin. And if I let my breath go, I would start to sink. So for me, flying, at least in that story, was a lot about trying to escape, but it also seemed something that the narrators felt like they had control of the situation. They were flyers, their children would be flyers, and everything was within their grasp. And throughout the course of that story, them being prodigals sort of reveals itself to be like a razor thin grasp of the situation, and a grasp on their children that they no longer can sustain. And so to me, that The reason why the book is titled The Rock Eaters is, to me, it felt a lot like this, the buoyancy of flying, but a razor thin one. And that feeling of freedom, but also knowing that the ground was right there and was sort of nipping at the heels.
Mm, yeah, I just, you were talking about those writers. I love them. I used to teach Juan Rulfo's a piece of his called Luvina. But can you talk about, because this is so present in your work, about the nature of literature, art, maybe, short stories, fiction, especially to create change. You know, you have the political, social, economic. I think about some of those great Latino, Latinx writers, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Pablo Neruda, Carlos Fuentes, Isabel Allende, Octavio Paz, and even artists like Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, all of those whose work spoke to the masses, to people who would find inspiration in their work and then act on it, that work was specifically a catalyst for change. Do you think that writers have a sort of responsibility, you know, to the greater good, or to, I don't know, to make change?
That's a great question. I think every writer sort of views their place differently in that answer. I know the novel that I'm working on now has very much to do with violence and change, and it's about the 1965 Civil War in the Dominican Republic, and then the American invasion in between. And I was really obsessed with sort of family stories about that time because of that very question, like, what does it mean to cause change, especially when some of that change is violent, or change requires harm to other people along the way. And so it was a question I was really thinking about. And one of the things that struck me is you can't make change if your eyes aren't open, or you can make change, but is it change that's predicated on awareness? And so for me, at least my place on it, I don't necessarily think that my writing is going to inspire specific action, but I do want it to be the action of eyes opening. I want people to sort of think about a perspective in a way that they haven't before, that will become sort of the basis of the awareness of what could change if only we let it, or if only we thought about it.
That is a beautiful thought to end on. I wish we had a lot more time. Your work is beautiful. I felt like when I was reading it, I was underlining lines. I felt like there were moments, you know, some of those lines you just can't come back from. They're just so beautiful. So I want to thank you for doing this tonight, and thank Writers and Books. And I hope if anybody who is watching this hasn't bought the book, that they go out and buy it.
Thanks so much, Angelique, and thank you to Writers and Books and Dan.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you to Brenda and Angelique. Buy the book. The link is in the chat. I want to thank our funders here. You can catch up with previous readings on our website, including this one. It should be up there next week. And I want to say thank you and have a great night.
Thanks so much, and support indie bookstores.
That's right. Have a good night.